emprendimiento de Silicon Valley, que es famosa por su agilidad, por su deseo de tomar riesgos, y esto por supuesto ha llevado al crecimiento de muchas compañías exitosas que nunca se habrían formado sin ese espíritu. ¿Qué factores son importantes en su construcción? ¿Cómo los emprendedores continuarán o no tomando riesgos? ¿O si se verá un cambio en ese sentido? ¿Cuál sería el impacto del COVID en el ecosistema de innovación? ¿Qué tendencias están surgiendo? Y tenemos para esto a dos invitados espectaculares a quienes les agradecemos por su tiempo y por estar aquí acompañándonos con esta audiencia, principalmente de Colombia y de Latinoamérica. La primera es Purnima Kochikar, quien es directora de Google Play Apps and Games en Google. Ella viene de una carrera en diferentes compañías y ahorita nos va a contar un poco más sobre justamente su trayectoria y su conocimiento en el ecosistema de Silicon Valley. Y Jitendra Kavathekar, quien es fundador y es el General Partner de H3BC, que es una empresa de capital de riesgo B2B con enfoque en compañías que desencadenan transformaciones digitales. Además, es miembro de la Junta Directiva de la Cámara de Comercio de Silicon Valley, de quien Purnima también fue, de hecho, miembro. Así que ellos son ex colegas de la Cámara de Comercio. Para nosotros en Xtrategy Center es un placer poderlos tener aquí. Nosotros Xtrategy somos una firma de negocios, de inversión, de innovación, y también tenemos una división de arbitraje con operaciones en Colombia, en Panamá y en Washington. Y dentro de nuestros servicios, pues brindamos, además de consultoría organizacional y estrategias de internacionalización, pues la posibilidad de que empresarios y ejecutivos de cientos de empresas de Latinoamérica conozcan las mejores prácticas de negocios en el mundo a través, pues, de misiones y de visitas empresariales a corporaciones, a startups, a universidades y a centros de pensamiento, think tanks en el mundo. Y estas misiones son misiones en las que participan, estas visitas, en las que participan las juntas directivas de las compañías, los comités ejecutivos, funcionarios de entidades públicas, los grupos directivos de las empresas, los directores de mercadeo, de gestión humana, de innovación. Y no son para copiar y pegar, sino para abrir la mente a nuevas realidades, a nuevas formas de hacer las cosas. Por eso las empresas que van con nosotros a los diferentes destinos en Israel, en Silicon Valley, en España, etcétera, al llegar de regreso con frecuencia cambian los paradigmas e innovan al interior de sus empresas. Evidentemente este año pues las visitas las tuvimos que posponer por el COVID, así que decidimos darle este regalo virtual, darles a nuestros clientes este regalo, además gratuito, y para los demás decidimos abrirlo para construir y aportar en la conversación nacional de cómo podemos salir juntos a través de la innovación, a través del emprendimiento y cómo podemos aprender de lo que otros ecosistemas de innovación han hecho en el mundo. Por eso, para nosotros es tan importante este webinar, porque creemos que estamos aportando a que no solamente nuestros clientes, sino en general todas las entidades, empresas y emprendedores en Colombia y en Latinoamérica puedan aprender alrededor de este tema. No nos queda faltando sino un webinar, el webinar número 4, en el que estaremos hablando sobre la cultura del emprendimiento en Israel. Es este 3, es decir, el viernes a las 11 de la mañana, hora de Colombia, donde también los esperamos. Así que bueno, sin más preámbulos, pues le doy paso a Jitendra. Jitendra, bienvenido. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much for participating. Me voy a pasar ahora a inglés para hablar con nuestros invitados. Si ustedes quieren escuchar en el idioma en el que estamos originalmente conversando, pueden seleccionar en la opción de interpretación off. Si quieren escucharlo solamente en inglés, seleccionan inglés, o si quieren escucharlo solamente en español, lo seleccionan en español. Así que bienvenidos a todos. Jitendra, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. And we would like you to introduce yourself and talk to us a little bit about how you're looking at the whole ecosystem. And then we will have some time with Purnima, and then we will have some questions.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Pablo. And thank you for the organization for having me. It's very exciting to participate in this conversation. I've spent some time recently in Colombia and along with leaders across Latin America in the investment and also impact world as well. So it's a special honor for me to be part of this. Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, so background-wise, I have a technology background. You know, of course, I'm an immigrant from India, came to the United States very early when I was a child. So grew up in the United States all through the schooling, went to college and University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, which nowadays is only known because Satya Nadella, CEO of Microsoft, went there, and it was a classmate of mine. But it's a great school. And just grew up in the tech world, worked with Hewlett Packard back in the early days doing printers. I was an engineer, but pretty quickly found out that I want to kind of understand the bigger picture, became a director at Hewlett Packard, you know, within about 6 years, manager and then director. So I got the bug when I came to Silicon Valley, went to a startup. We did the operating system for the Apple iPod with Tony Fadell. A company called Pixo, went on to run engineering organizations at companies like Palm and Motorola, a few other startups. Was also a vice president of web analytics at Yahoo. So you can see what I'm giving you all this kind of big career resume is it's not atypical to see people here try different things and get excited about different things and go through the life cycle of startups, the ups and the downs. After Yahoo, I was CEO of a small startup for about 3 years. And then after that, I joined Accenture, where I founded the Open Innovation Program for the company globally. It spanned 12 regions around the world. And we partnered with startups to go to market together. It's about $1 billion business now at Accenture. And we did about 20 investments, Accenture Ventures, where I was managing director. And today, I'm translating kind of that diversity of background and experiences to a venture fund that we've started called Horizon 3 Venture Capital. We invest in the future of how we live and work. We think automation is playing a key role, and we invest at the early stage for B2B companies. So that's my background. Sorry I spoke for so long. I forgot what your second question was. What would you like me to say?
Yeah, well, the first question, an open question, is how are you looking at the current ecosystem in Silicon Valley? The two of you have had the chance to have conversations and experience with both the corporate world, also entrepreneurs, because of your job, your work, and with different stakeholders in the ecosystem in Silicon Valley. So in general, how do you read that ecosystem right now, also as a consequence of COVID-19?
Yeah, I'll give my quick response. Purnima will have a lot to talk about here as well. So I would say that, you know, I've lived through 3 of these. This is the third downturn in Silicon Valley, right? So the dot-com bust was very difficult. It took years to come out of that. And that one hit the Bay Area, the Silicon Valley pretty hard. The startup community was, you know, was decimated really because it went from a dot-com kind of mindset and realized that may not, you know, without the strong technology that this region is known for, may not really have a longer life. Then went through the Great Recession in 2008. That was also pretty devastating, but that also created a whole new wave of startups in all sorts of new technologies. It was a triggering of the digital transformations amongst the corporates. And investments have been very strong since then. And with this one, I'd say we're in the middle of the downturn. I think right now the stock market is strong enough where people still feel somewhat optimism, although the unemployment rate is very high. As it relates to startups, I don't see much of a slowdown, frankly, in terms of companies that we're looking at to invest in. We still see very strong startups, very strong founding teams. At this early stage. So we don't have a lot to worry about in terms of valuations just now, whereas later stage VCs would have that issue. But there's a lot to talk about. So I'll just kind of pause there. I think we're in the middle of a change. And for now, things seem to be holding, but there's of course a lot to talk about.
Well, you have mentioned something that has caught my attention, because unemployment rate the rise to a record of 14.7% in April. Now it did decrease a little bit to 13.3% as reported today. we're seeing some kind of good news in that regard. But how is that unemployment, which is very high anyway, and here in Colombia is above the 21%, which is probably the highest in many years. So how do you see that the impact of that unemployment rate is actually going to change the dynamic and the Silicon Valley ecosystem, not only for companies, but also and for consumption, but also for the entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I think it's a very sad thing to see this high of unemployment rate, and it's a very dangerous situation for all of us, all countries that are going through this right now. It is, I think we feel that there's a lot of change that's happening in terms of how consumption is happening. You can see there's a lot of digital technologies that are being used. You just look in healthcare in terms of remote health. You look at food, and you look at food delivery. And then there's also the kind of social distancing that's happening when people actually go outside and using masks. So as it relates to the unemployment side, I think it's a very terrible situation. I think, like most, emergencies, it requires innovation. And I think we're starting to see entrepreneurs starting to look at how to innovate through that and bring some new capabilities that allow for these remote type of experiences to be still effective. Because at the end of the day, people still have to go to a grocery store and eat. People still have to get their health. Kids still have to get their education. And so I think necessity is the mother of invention, as they say. And I think that's still going to be a very strong part of what we do.
Right. And what about the other dimensions that these viruses actually bring in onto us? How do you think that, for example, the flows of investment within the USA and for emerging countries will actually change for entrepreneurs and for companies? We have seen in the last days that the whole charities and science funds have actually seen declines in the way that they get funds and money. There is a cancellation of major fundraisers, forces groups to actually lay off staff and delay or trim or cancel grants to scientists. And probably the same thing is actually happen to entrepreneurs. Is that something that you guys are seeing in the States?
I'll answer first on this. I would say, there's been at least one survey done just recently, published last week, amongst investors into, let's say, venture funds. So not grants, but let's say venture funds. And that survey went to about 100 different types of investors, institutional investors, as well as family offices and fund of funds. And the sentiment, one of the top line sentiments out of that was that the appetite to invest in venture funds is not, it may have taken a bit of a pause, but as of right now, expectations are that 2020 investments are going to be just as strong as 2019 investments were. So when we went into this the pandemic, and when we went to the shutdown, of course, everybody thought, look, for the next 18 months to 2 years, it's going to pretty much shut down. But as I was saying earlier, we're in the middle of this pandemic and our response to it and readjusting to it. And as of right now, it's pretty strong and healthy limited partner LP investor community there. But that's just a Silicon Valley mindset. That does not necessarily apply to investors around the world. And we have an office in Canada, and so we talk to potential investors there, other VCs there, et cetera. And it's a lot more conservative there, of course, and a lot more cautious about it. But interestingly, in Silicon Valley, the resilience is still there, and we're all scratching our heads, trying to understand how to marry the high unemployment with the high stock market, and investors seem to be coming back at the table. Startups are still strong, but that's a very local phenomenon in Silicon Valley, and we recognize that. As far as the grant money, I can't speak to it though, but I think there's so much pressure right now, financially and operationally, that all sorts of organizations are going through. But I would imagine that you'll also see more grant money going towards some of the new things in healthcare, new things in education, for example. I think those things are still going to be needed. And I think in terms of research into viruses and how to handle epidemics, I really hope that that we have the ability to invest more in that, knowing what we just went through.
Yeah, it comes to the question about the fear of failure that not only the entrepreneurs but also the actual investors have during this uncertain times. I mean, I did read in the there is a study called Startup Genome Association or institution, and they talk about some different impacts in different regions for the global venture capital funding, and how it may have actually dropped in some of these in those locations. But then, how do you see that fear of failure will actually shift as a consequence of COVID? Do you think that people, which is probably one of the main drivers for entrepreneurship and innovation in general, do you think that that's going to make a change?
Yeah, I think there's the philosophical way of looking at this, which is that either you look at it as risk capital or you look at it as venture capital. And that in itself gives you a sense of how people think about that capital. Right. If it's venture capital, it's about using it towards venturing into creating and innovating and bring something new to the world. That's what venture capital would imply. Of course, there's risk, but you're willing to take the risk, a higher amount of risk, to go make things happen. If you think about it as risk capital, then of course, as the name implies, the risk aspect of decision making is a much higher aspect of it. And and more quantitatively, if you look at the IRRs and the performance of funds coming out of the Great Recession in 2008, it's the strongest it's ever been. The vintages coming out of funds, the funds that come out of downturns, are very strong. The valuations are much more reasonable when you look at these startups. These downturns have discouraged new startups that may not have a strong thesis or a strong team or strong conviction, because of course you need a lot of conviction to lead a startup, regardless of good situation or bad situation. So you kind of get the best of the best at valuations that are a little bit more affordable. And so the dollar, or the capital, goes a long way when you invest in these. And so that creates that. And then also, of course, societally, there's a big shift just happened. I think, in the United States, the FDA allowed telehealth medicine to happen very, very quickly. Frankly, like that, it happened. And so, and there's, of course, the way people are working is more and more remote now. So we just went through, I think, kind of a pilot phase for all these major trends that we've been talking about for years, decades, of remote work, remote health, remote education. We talked about all these things, right? We've been thinking about it. We've been putting it on our nice slides of the future of work and the future of education, all these trends. We just went through a forced pilot phase, and we're still going through it. So as we come out of this pilot phase, when the epidemic comes down and we're able to kind of go back to the new normal, or go to a new normal, we would have learned a lot in this time frame on how these systems can work in this new way. And I think in there you'll find entrepreneurs, and you'll find investors and researchers that are able to say, this is a real thing. It was always a real thing technologically, but it wasn't a real thing from a societal acceptance perspective. And from that perspective, we just went through a phase where people now feel what that looks like. And I think that's something to build upon. Right. And I think you see a lot of that coming up now.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, I would like to welcome Purnima again. Purnima, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. First of all, thank you for having me. Good morning, everybody. It is exciting for me. This is exciting for me, right? That we can be wherever we are and have a conversation. As Jitendra pointed out, we are no longer limited by geographic boundaries, etc., to have an exchange of ideas. I think this shows what is possible. So who am I? I work for Google. I manage the app ecosystem on Android. And that means my team works with entrepreneurs and large companies across the world and provides business and technical consulting. I've spent, like Jitendra, I'm a first generation immigrant.
You went on mute.
I think you want, I think you're on mute.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I've been talking to myself.
No, okay. No. It was only the last 5 seconds.
Oh, interesting. I didn't touch anything. As I was saying, I'm a first generation immigrant, came here for university, worked for big and small companies, started as a software engineer, went on to get my MBA, worked for small companies after that, everything from education to building large telco switches, moved to Nokia, had many different roles at Nokia. I joined Nokia when it was on a tear and a big upswing. That's one of the nice things about the Valley or tech companies in general. You can wear many hats inside a company. So did many different things from being a product manager for camera phones to rolling out messaging services to managing the developer ecosystem. Google found me on Google. This is the other thing I think people should be aware of. What we do today is public property. So what you say and where you say matters. I was just fortunate that something I said clicked. And so I've been at Google from the ground up, from when Play was started, and built out the team for the ecosystem. So here I am, right? What am I seeing? There's a few universal...
Sorry. Purnima, the thing that you didn't mention is that when you joined Google, you were just like 5 of you, right?
Yes, well, not Google.
Well, not in Google, in Google Play. Yes.
I wish I was at 5 of us when I was joining Google. then I would be like Jitendra, funding things. Right now, I'm right. So I did join. Yes, when I joined Google Play, we were 5 of us. So it's been an incredible ride. But that incredible ride isn't possible if entrepreneurs don't take a bet. Android, as I say, is a blank canvas, right? It's an operating system. Nobody cares unless somebody builds on it. Right. Somebody did something amazing on it, whether they build a phone or they build an app. And that's what's exciting about my role.
And how many are you guys all over the world in Google Play? And how much money does actually passes through Google Play right nowadays?
A lot. We don't break out our revenues from Google. But what is interesting, I think, is for me, the bigger question is how many are building on Google Play and where do they come from? So maybe I should take a couple minutes to talk about, you talked to Jitendra about the pandemic and what are you seeing, etc. What has been exciting for us is on 2 sides. When you're a marketplace, you have people who use it and people who build for it, right? We are seeing that entrepreneurship is thriving everywhere. The very foundation of the, I like how Jitendra talked about risk capital versus venture capital. I honestly don't think entrepreneurs who think about risk can actually build anything. There's inherent risk, whether it is, no pandemic or there is pandemic. Entrepreneurs just look at opportunity. So what we are seeing is new apps coming out for literally every solution that you're talking about, but more importantly, every person translating, innovating, and growing. Take for example, a little company called Zomato in India, right? They started off by being sort of like a company that tells you whether a restaurant is good or bad. But nobody goes to restaurants anymore.
Right.
And over the period of the pandemic, they've translated into everything from grocery shopping to food delivery to everything else. That kind of resilience and the ability to change is what inspires me. So that's on the develop side. On the use side, there's a few things that have been interesting. People, as Jitendra pointed out, have started using tech, which they may not have used previously. right? So they, whether it is Zoom calls for conferences, maybe you would have visited the Silicon Valley, a different way of talking, to telemedicine, etc. We are seeing that the curves are flattening. But what is interesting is it's happening everywhere. The notion that this happens in the valley and that happens in emerging markets, the notion that young people use certain things and old people use certain other things, the notion that women don't play games and men play games, all of that is gone. All of that is gone. Everybody does what they need. And that's magical for me. The notion that people can find the tools they need when they need it and are using it is magical. And then the last bit I will say is it is amazing to see how young people are stepping up and using tech to solve real problems. I just got to know this team in New York called Invisible Hands. People should look it up. These are young folks. One is a junior in college, etc. They realize that there are lots of perhaps older people who have real issues in terms of being immune compromised and are the audience that are most vulnerable when it comes to COVID. They have started buying groceries and delivering. And they use the oldest of tech. They let people call in, right? So we can think of really smart tech. They let people call in. They use the oldest of ways of telling their service. They created flyers and put it under doors. And now they're moving into Slack, and now they're moving into Zoom, and now they're moving into more interesting tech. But what I'm pointing out is solutions can be found when there is a need and somebody cares.
Absolutely. And the same thing is actually happening in organizations, in companies, because I actually think that the COVID-19 has done what probably boards and management committees hadn't done in last year. So they say that probably this is an advance of 6 years in terms of the digital transformation, right? You are actually in contact, like for your day job, with developers who actually create new ways of doing things. So developers are probably the epitome of innovation in that regard. How do you think that those innovative ways are actually influencing the whole digital ecosystem and the whole Silicon Valley ecosystem? Is it actually shifting somehow?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You know, my ecosystem, I'm here in Silicon Valley, but it is around the world, right? So I think the question that is to be asked is, yes, in some ways it is shifting. In other ways, it remains the same, right? The reality is, as you said, these developers have been trying to build new things for as long as I know them. Mm-hmm. The problem set has shifted. The kinds of things they're trying to solve may have shifted. But other than that, they've been doing what they know best. A few things that are important. At the end of the day, entrepreneurship is about humans. And one of the things that is emblematic about entrepreneurial companies is small groups of humans coming together and literally living with each other, right? My husband is a serial entrepreneur. My house becomes a bed and breakfast. Sometimes when this happens, people come and literally live on my couch, right? That has shifted. How does a company create a culture when they're starting and they're not together? Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting thing. Talking to founders, talking to early stage ones, not the later ones, because they know their teams. It's been very, very interesting to see how they're thinking about founding teams, how they think about staying in touch, how they think about this thing where they literally used to feel that they have to be together, play together, eat together, what that is happening. And trying to understand remote working and remote culture building has been an interesting exercise in talking to leaders, but it's also been very freeing. The race for talent in the Silicon Valley is immense. Now they're no longer constrained about talent in the Silicon Valley. So they're thinking creatively, like they can hire a great engineer wherever, it doesn't matter, right? And they can build things across time zones, doesn't matter. So they're really thinking about interesting ways of how software is built remotely if your entire team is remote, the kinds of tools you can use to keep teams together, etc. So in some ways it is constraining and they're thinking deeply about culture. In other ways it's very freeing because of talent acquisition wherever the talent is.
Absolutely, and I think that opens the possibility for companies, not only the States, but across the globe, to bring talent from other regions, from different disciplines, which actually will impact in a very positive manner diversity. Now, the piece that is missing in that like very ideal stage is how will regulation change in that regard to ensure that we do have the possibility to hire people from different places. What do you think that will happen?
I'm not an expert on regulation. I'm also very fortunate to be in a very global company that has offices anywhere. And so we can hire pretty much anywhere. I don't fully understand how maybe smaller companies have to deal with, but my experience, what I've seen, is that more and more people are willing to hire people in other geographies and other places to be able to work with people. I do not know whether they have to deal with how they pay them, etc. I'm assuming they have to find some way to pay them with payroll in other places. I don't know if Jitendra, you have an idea since you invest in these companies. I don't go into the details of how people get paid in remote places.
Yeah, no, I would agree, Purnima. I think that there's a natural affinity that entrepreneurs have towards each other when they have a common goal. And as Purnima mentioned, it's a human endeavor, of course. And so I think there's a natural affinity, regardless of boundaries of geographic boundaries or other boundaries, or even type of backgrounds people have. Even languages, I think, are playing less and less of a role as a barrier. So
You're right.
In fact, we have a startup in our portfolio that does have a team in Medellin. And I was surprised to know that. I just found that out. I mean, it's surprising, but of course it's understood. And I think on the point about startups, I think there's something to maybe notice here. 2012, 2013, 2014, somewhere, about 6, 7, 8 years ago, corporates were looking at this and saying, we have to be more like startups. How do you make corporate dance, and this whole thing, right? And so that was all the beginning of this digital transformation journey, and the role that technology can trigger and new business models can trigger great new business models. A lot of inspiration was coming from these startups. If you look at it today, if you look at the likes of Microsoft and Google, of course, Amazon and others, it's a tremendous amount of innovation that's happening. Tremendous. And these corporates are not the same as they were 8 years ago. They are moving very, very fast on big shifts on the technology landscape. And the ecosystems of startups that are forming around these companies, let's say Google, if you look at what Purnima is doing with Google Play, look at what Google's doing with GCP, all that tremendous power that's coming from these large corporates that used to be old and stodgy. Google was never old and stodgy, but others were. Is coming to bear for startups to move even faster on what they are trying to do. So this whole dichotomy of startup versus corporate and everything, some of it's ancient history. And it's really about ecosystems. And it's really about how the big and small can partner together. It's really about people in this geography and that geography partnering together. It's about different backgrounds partnering together. I mean, we're going through this massive shift right now where the boundaries that kind of dictated how we think about the world are kind of going away. And I think with the entrepreneurs, you have to have that mindset of exploration. And I think the entrepreneurs, the business owners, are exploring that new world without these boundaries, to put a philosophical angle on this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm very happy that you have one of your companies in my hometown, Medellin, actually. So, so that's good to hear. Now, I have an open question for the two of you guys. How did your agenda change as a consequence of the pandemic? Has it shifted? Has it changed somehow?
I can go and you
Yes,
can.
please.
One of the things that we always talk about when we talk about strategy is about focus and really taking away what you will not do, not only about what you will do. I do think that for us, at least for my team, we have more we could do than we have time and people, always, right? Because the ecosystem is much bigger than any team. This crisis created a couple of interesting things. One, in the most isolated of times, we became more connected as individuals. We can see each other's homes, we can see kids and pets, and we realized that they're juggling a lot of different things, which also meant that for a team that is working remotely, we had to be very, very clinically precise about what our priorities are. That's number one. I think that is a very interesting, everybody says it, but I think this forced it more than ever. Google is very good about prioritizing, but this forced that even more. So that was kind of an interesting. So my agenda, I would say, is more precise right now. Now you could argue, does it mean that we forget the moonshots? Does it mean that we try to do here and now versus future? We are constantly debating that, and we're constantly balancing that. So that's number one, which of course taking the human element into account. Two, we constantly looking across to say what were our assumptions and what assumptions we need to rethink, because so much of what goes into strategy or what we do, or your agenda as you call it, is based on what you assume about the world. So what are we not seeing? And so that's been an interesting polarity. That's been an interesting exercise to say, can I simplify to make my team successful when they're juggling with all of these things and working remotely? To how do I make sure that I'm not ignoring signals, the weak signals? So there is a thing about clarity versus exploration, which I think has been an interesting push.
Attention, yes.
The one last thing I will say is, we say this all the time, it's more important than ever. Listen. We talk about listening to our customers. We talked about listening to developers. We talk about all of those things. It's been an interesting exercise to truly test those assumptions by listening and saying what is important to developers. So for example, being classic problem solvers, we're like, I think they have these problems, we should jump in and solve it. And we found that a lot of them didn't have those problems. And so listening, I think, is the last thing I would say, more actively than ever before. Jitendra?
Yeah, I think from our side, from the investment side, I'll speak first, and generally speaking about entrepreneurs. Our thesis, I think, has been fairly resilient through this. And in fact, it's impossible to say you never change your strategy in a major shift in the world. So we are looking at things a little bit differently. But the fundamental thesis of the future of how we live and work was really built upon certain technologies we feel are going to be part of it. Certain types of entrepreneurs are going to create it, and certain industries are going to be affected very, very deeply. And for us, those industries that we're playing in are healthcare, the enterprise, something we call smart living, and the industrial sectors. Are going through massive shifts. So are many other areas: hospitality, restaurants, etc., education. A lot of other areas are also. But what we've been focusing on, I think, is still important. I think it's also very important for us, and even more so now, that while before the pandemic hit, I think we were very kind of, we can say, we had a good strategy. We have a portfolio model. We have areas in our thesis that we invest in. And so that's strategically looking at how we want to invest. But we're very tactical when we're looking at companies in terms of what do they do, what features do they have, which initial customers do they have. And we kind of got bogged down into finding the differentiation in this company versus their competitors, and why are we investing in this company. And you kind of need to be, because when things are good, you're going to have a lot of competitors, and you need to have some differentiation. You have to go fast. Now, when we look at things, we realize the world is changing and has changed to some degree, and there will be a new normal coming. So we want to see big ideas. We want to see bold ideas. I wouldn't call it moonshots, maybe in the way that Purnima maybe mentioned moonshots. I mean, I think we still are very practical in seeing how this can be applied into these different verticals, and we want to see big ideas, more so than before. And you would think every VC wants to see big ideas, but when you're kind of in a competitive space, of course you want to see big ideas, but you also want to see returns. You want to see it fairly quickly. So now I think we have a lot more space to do that. And I think that's very refreshing, because that brings us back to kind of our passions for, you know, how is the world changing? I think the other thing that we're also seeing is it's just natural. I think people want to find a way to help and to be part of the societal change in a positive way. And you see it in the entrepreneurs. And I think of course we welcome that. And in fact, I think we're starting to get our own feeling that we need to see some of that in our investments. You know, I think the gender diversity has been an issue and is being, you know, at least engaged right now. And so you're starting to see some changes there, but there's a long way to go. Of course, the major issues in the United States right now in terms of the protesting on police brutality and Black Lives Matter, those things are seeping into conversation. This is where the world is going, and I think entrepreneurs are part of this fabric. And you know, we used to just think about it as small medium businesses back in the 90s and the 80s and, you know, 70s. That's for the United States. That's what's kind of was a big part of the GDP, was coming from small medium businesses. But now the entrepreneurs are such a big part of our you know, our world, that it may not have the numbers that we're talking about, but certainly some of these companies do become Uber and Airbnb and others, and they do become big. And so I think we can naturally see these societal shifts permeate through the entrepreneurial community, and it's a very welcome thing to do. The last thing I'll say is we also have a kind of renewed interest in the small medium business world, right? So let's talk about middle America. But this could apply to Latin America. It could apply to Europe. It could apply to lots of places, where you have people that are, you know, small businesses run by a family or run by a small partnership. And what are they doing that can make them even better, right? How do they use data? How do they go through their own transformations internally as a small business? Not at the stage that a large corporate would go through a 3-year transformation journey, but certainly the tools and the capabilities and the data and the mindset and the way to think about your business, and that it's not just brick and mortar, it's brick and mortar plus e-commerce. How do you bring all of that together for that community? And we just invested in a startup that does go after that. And we're very excited about that. We think that's a huge opportunity. And that's kind of the digitization of the kind of heartland of the United States when it comes to how entrepreneurs operate and how small businesses operate. And I think there's a great opportunity to bring some new ideas and new technologies to them.
Okay.
Maybe I'll take this opportunity to jump in here. In case you weren't on our last webinar, my name is Nick Schrammick with Silicon Valley Forum in Silicon Valley. So I touched on last time some of the nuts and bolts of why Silicon Valley is special, and why it's both a mentality and how both create a very special ecosystem. And both of you touched on what happened in 2008, 2009, comparing it to what's happening now, and how the Great Recession really signified this fundamental shift of how enterprise companies interact with startups and how they engage with the innovation ecosystem. And that flexibility of Silicon Valley is always something that really struck me as special. So innovation in business models, but also the focus on different technologies. So how easily Silicon Valley seamlessly transitions from making silicon chips and to software engineering, and now really into the focusing on fourth industrial revolution technologies and new business models and new ways to invest. So that evolution, I think, is really special, and I think we can agree we're at a new inflection point where new business models and new thinking will be needed on the part of Silicon Valley in order for it to evolve and remain flexible. What do you see out of the Valley in the next cycle? Do you think this flexibility will continue to serve it? And what changes do you think we'll see in the next 5 or 10 years?
Purnima, you want to go first, or would you like me to?
You can go first. I can.
Okay. Yeah, Nick, good question. So what do we think are going to be the big changes coming out of this? So I think there's two streams, right? I think there's the first stream that was pre-pandemic, like you said, fourth industrial revolution, changes in healthcare. There's some big shifts that were already kind of in play, and I think those are going to continue out. I think for those types of trends, there's, for safety reasons, for reasons that we can all understand, there might be a slowdown in terms of some of these shifts, because you don't want, construction has slowed down a bit, although it's starting up again. But again, depending on the spread of the infection, it might slow back down. So I think there's a temporary kind of pause in some of these things. But I think for the longer term, I think you'll see those trends continue. And I think, as we talked about, the second type of transformations that are going on has been this pilot phase we're going through right now. And I mentioned a few in terms of healthcare, in terms of education, food delivery. I think there's some things that we are experiencing right now and living with that will continue. I think there's also, on the consumer side, people are living at home with each other more. So, I mean, it's you don't have these kind of old models where, the parents are out, the kids are at home alone, and, people are doing their thing and they come home after dinner. That's not happening right now. So I think families are finding themselves again. Hopefully everybody's finding themselves again. And I think it's an opportunity for some trends to emerge out of that as well. I think there probably will be, and hopefully it's a longer lasting feeling, that I hope that there's opportunities for families to engage each other. It's as weird as that sounds, because people live in the same house, but actually have ways that they relate with each other even at a deeper level than they had before. So I think there's innovations in the home. There's things with smart living and other types of things that I think that can fold in there.
Yeah, I echo all of that. A couple of things to think about. Jitendra talked about the shifts that are happening at a societal level, whether it is in terms of racial justice, etc. There's an interesting thing, right? The smartphone is documenting life. Whether you think about refugees, one of those things that the SVP who manages Android and Chrome, etc., I think was at some talk somewhere, and one of these advocates for refugees was showing pictures about his own journey from Syria to London and all the kids. And the one thing that struck him very deeply was that everybody held on to their phones, young and old. And it's an interesting thing to think that, we do talk about, if you contrast that with what Jitendra just said, families discovering each other. The smartphone has been maligned as people sitting next to each other and sitting and staring at their screens and perhaps not talking to each other. But in an interesting way, it is documenting life. It is connecting to people. It is getting to this thing. So it's an interesting thing. We ask ourselves, what is our responsibility in that world? What is the kinds of tech that is needed to enable connectivity when there isn't? How do we enable information sharing, accuracy? At the same time, people have been talking about, a very direct thing we're doing right now in terms of being able to open the economy is contact tracing. Complicated, necessary, and what you call nuanced, right? We are looking at how to protect individual privacy, but at the same time, think about individual responsibility to society. So if I know I came in contact with somebody, will I self-quarantine? Interestingly, for contact tracing, everybody has to lean in. We sort of have to say that I will be able to give my information for the greater good. So it's an interesting thing to think about. What are those new models? And if that is the new model for the future, that everybody leans in for the greater good, what would those models look like? I think that's one area that we are looking at deeply. With that comes things like sensors. With that things comes like responsible use of technology, etc.
That leads me to a question that Jaime Alvarado has actually asked in our chat, which is, do you actually think that the needs pyramid, or pyramid as Maslow would call it, has then changed?
That's an interesting question. Depending on Maslow's hierarchy, a lot of people talk about connectivity below even food and other things. One thing that I can talk about is the desire for humans to be together. Whether, some of us are fortunate enough to live with family. A lot of people are alone and families are far away. One of the interesting models, Nick, to your question that's coming about is co-viewing, co-sharing, co-doing things. Lots of technical complexities about making video streams, synchronize, etc. But, the things that you would do, get together to watch sports on a Sunday, or whatever else it is, that how do you do co-viewing, co-sharing, sing karaoke together. I think there is different and interesting models that are coming of people wanting to do things together. And I think that shows that perhaps connectivity is as foundational as food, drink, for humans.
Right,
yeah.
Okay.
I think I would just like to add to that, and I think Purnima, you sparked in me this whole idea about societal shifts, and this question about Maslow's hierarchy is kind of going into that too. I think that technology allows us to do things better and to do new things. What we decide to do with it is up to us as users of it and consumers of it. And I think it's almost we're quickly going into a world where you can do a lot more things now than you were able to do 3 years ago. Right? Just think about that, and a ton more than you were able to do 10 years ago. So 5 years from now, 10 years from now, your agency is going to be much higher. Your ability to do things is going to be much higher. It's going to come down to much more of what do you want to do. And I think the efficiency of ideas spreading, the efficiencies of movements spreading, the efficiency of just information spread is, I think, going to bring an even more pointed and poignant question of how different people think about things differently and how do they engage with each other. And it's going to come down to, you go back to classic Greek philosophy and other ancient philosophies. A lot of those ideas are going to be much more efficiently expressed. How the United States was formed. You see all the political issues in the United States. You're seeing it around the world, frankly. They're opposing viewpoints of how society should be formed and how they should live. And I think those conversations are going to be front and center for us from now on. We were able to go through an inefficient distribution of information. We were able to kind of go through inefficient organization of people's ideas and voices. And we were able to kind of go through lack of data, through lack of connectivity. We can go through society when Maslow created his hierarchy of the physiological things that we need to get to a point of love, right? And we need food, we need shelter, et cetera. And to get to a point of love and acceptance. Well, certainly those things have not gone away. I mean, food and shelter are still very important, and there's a lot of people in this world that don't have that. And that is absolutely something that needs to be addressed, and it will need to be addressed, and it will be addressed. But if you're talking about future trends, the point of the pyramid is even pointier up on top. And I think that's around this idea of how do people engage in diametrically opposed viewpoints in a safe way? How do we build trust in our new digital worlds that we operate in? How much do you trust others? How much do others trust you? Is going to be a factor where you are on this hierarchy. And I think we as technologists and entrepreneurs and investors and all in this ecosystem and consumers have a responsibility, I think, to this question about Maslow's hierarchy of what does that future world look like? And how do we make sure we have trust? And how do we make sure that we're able to keep our humanness, which is messy? It doesn't fit into a box. It can fit into an algorithm for habits, but being a human is more than being a habit, I hope. I think some philosophers have said that humans are creatures of habit, and unfortunately 99% of our time is probably that's true. but that 1% of our time is still human and creative. And how do we preserve that?
Jitendra, especially in a moment in which we don't have the opportunity to have a conversation face to face with our colleagues while drinking a coffee at the office, right? So that is actually changing the way that we build relations.
Yeah, but I truly, well, first of all, very beautifully said, Jitendra. I do think about the trust, but interestingly, though, one thing that has, I'll say two separate things. One, to your coffee comment, we were having coffee, but did we know the human? I feel like we know the human a bit more right now because we're seeing them as a whole. We're seeing them struggle with their kids and their pets and everything else. Chances are we were having coffee with somebody who put on a professional veneer and came to work while they were thinking about their kid at home or a sick parent or whatever else. I think we've broken down some walls when we're actually very isolated. It's an interesting thing for me. I feel I know my team a lot more in a textured way than when I sat next to them in a cube 4 feet away, right? So it's an interesting thing to think about. Because everybody was in a Google office. They all looked the same. But now homes in Japan are very different than the homes in Dubai are very different. It's interesting and textured. The other side of it, which we talked about, if Maslow's hierarchy is about connectivity at the bottom, to me is access to information. I do think it even separates the haves and have-nots even more. We all said, oh, we'll just go to school from home. And seems easy. Even in the more affluent places, in places like Malaysia and India, people don't have Wi-Fi in the house. Forget the poor. If you look at the United States, kids won't eat if schools are not open because they are only fed at school. I do believe that it is amplifying some of the disparities when we are apart. On the one hand, it is connecting us. On the other hand, it's amplifying. I'm getting more calls and more requests to say, I'm an inner city school. And we are talking about the richest country in the world, right? I'm not talking about the slums of Mumbai. I'm talking about Washington, D.C., next to where the power sits. People don't have Chromebooks or a laptop or anything else. How do they learn? And if learning is what allows us to be entrepreneurs tomorrow, and it feeds the young mind to question and to ask, and if they can't, and we know that kids lose what they learn over summer, right? What if that becomes even more? I do think we have a responsibility. As you said, Jitendra, there is a trust. I would add a word equity to it. And I think it's a very hard thing. On the one hand, it has connected us. We can hire people everywhere. Those are the good sides of us who can afford. I do think it's made another world more isolated than ever because they have no way to connect.
Right.
And in that way, I think it's more than food. So
I absolutely agree. Now, those ecosystems, you are not only familiar with the Silicon Valley ecosystem, but you guys are familiar with also ecosystems in developing countries. And that's a question that for us is also on top of our mind as of how can we ensure, and that's a question that was actually asked by Luis Alfredo Mendoza, how can we build better alignment and communication mechanisms which are fast, which are simple, for the innovation ecosystem to be more effective in terms of the alignment between the different stakeholders, which you guys in Silicon Valley have done beautifully. And I'm talking about academia, the state, all the chambers, the entrepreneurs, the venture capital funds, etc. What is the recipe? I know there is no recipe, but what is the actual advice that you can actually bring us for us in Colombia and Latin America to be more effective in that alignment between stakeholders in the ecosystem? Jitendra?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because different regions have different dynamics and have different stages of their kind of evolution. Maybe I'll reflect on, I was in Medellin in, I think September, October, and then I was in Medellin again, and Bogota in just before the shutdown, frankly, in late January. And one of the things I took away from that is, of course, I mean, if you look at one of the stakeholders being investors, it's still a risky game. You know, it still requires a lot of kind of trust that you have to trust the entrepreneur, and you have to know there's a high risk here, and that's why you're in it. So if you don't know these things, it's kind of hard to be in it in a full way. So I think there's this dichotomy. I think certainly with Ruta N and with Inapulsa and so many organizations, I think there's a celebration of entrepreneurs, and there's some kind of government kind of support for entrepreneurs and startup founders in Colombia, at least, and of course Latin America, and I think that's great. And I think the investment model has been largely somebody that you've been watching and knowing for quite a while. So there's this familiarity with this person for quite some time before you invest in that person. And there's a word of mouth, and everybody knows this entrepreneur. So as far as the question goes, in terms of what are more efficient ways to kind of align with the stakeholders, even in Silicon Valley, I wouldn't say it's supremely aligned. I think there's still a lot of inefficiencies between one of the stakeholders being an investor and the founder. And we have to try very hard to kind of stay connected. But maybe one big difference is that we want to stay connected. We want to get into it. And with our fund, our model is that we help our founders. That's the best way to know if you want to keep investing, is to actually help them and be part of the team. See if this is going to go anywhere. See if you're adding any value. And I think that's important. So maybe one way to address it philosophically is efficient communication, I think, is built upon interdependence. If there's no interdependence between the founder and the stakeholders, I mean, if there's no like, hey, I'm depending on you for this, and I'm depending on you for this, and I value my relationship because of this and that. If that's not strong, I don't know what efficiency mechanism of communication can be there on top of that. I mean, we have to kind of establish the baseline. And then all the right habits will happen. We have regular check-ins with our founders. We work on their behalf quite a bit. We use our ecosystem and our network to help that founder, so they benefit from our. So I don't have a strong answer for you. I'm just giving you some observations.
Yeah, a couple of things that I might add to that is, Jitendra talked about trust. Where do you draw the line between trusting the founder and letting them run with that creative idea, and bringing the structure and scrutiny to make sure that they're not running too far off? I think that's true in any kind of organization. Google is a very grounds up organization. Every person feels that they are owning their role and driving. So how do you do that thing? And what is your view? Leadership as an enabler, an investor as an enabler, is how Jitendra described, I think is different than a leader as a director, or a leader as a micromanager to figure out what is going on. I think that aspect about how leadership is defined at a very core, I think makes a difference. If there's one difference I see in my world, looking across the globe, I see that is the difference. Do leaders tolerate irreverence? Mm-hmm. Do they tolerate somebody asking a question and questioning status quo? How does society support? Think about failure. A failure that is maybe something that somebody that came out of hubris, versus failure that came out of something that people really tried and systems changed. So does society encourage entrepreneurship, or does society think about business outcomes? Most of the valley, if you really think about it, the valley that everybody talks about and you're here to learn from, is a valley made out of people who really thought about solving problems. And the downside of the valley, I think, has come from people really trying to think about it purely as business outcomes and ignoring the problems being solved. For me, at least, as I think about a global ecosystem, I encourage everybody to solve the problems for their markets. Don't try to create the Instacart for India. Don't try to create the Uber for somewhere else. Understand the local market, understand where and what matters. And I think that changes. You know, Jitendra talked about a company he invested in that is understanding how to do small and medium-sized businesses. How do they digitize? You know, that's the kind of thing. In Colombia, in India, there are lots of really small companies. How do you enable them to deliver? Because they have lots of people, rather than creating a company that delivers. And companies in India who are doing that, tapping into the corner stores, who already have the little guys who can deliver, but providing an technical infrastructure to solve local problems and question local biases on leadership. That would be my 2 cents.
That's actually a very insightful point. We're going to have a conversation with two great speakers on Friday about Israel, and Israel is a culture that you can actually, in which you see that hierarchy, that distance between hierarchies is very, very low. So people are able to speak up, are able to challenge their managers' views in a way that certainly we don't do in other parts of the world, and that's a huge difference in terms of how you approach those processes for creation and innovation, and not only as a startups but also as intra and like the whole ecosystem in within organizations, right? Entrepreneurship.
Absolutely. I might go one step further. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, yes, please do.
100 people on this call. Start with your kids or your siblings or somebody who you feel should not question you.
Right.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Let them ask the crazy questions. Let them ask the whys. I'm here because my folks enable that. Being a girl from small town India, I was supposed to say yes. And they encouraged me to say, why not? And I think that makes the whole difference.
That actually answers one question that Sergio Osorio had in our chat, which is one of the main aspects to break those paradigms and to foster an innovation culture. And I think that's certainly, if not the most important one of the most important ones. I'm conscious of time right now. I would actually be able to carry on here. I'm having such a good time, have another coffee with you and carry on. But I'm conscious of time, and I know, guys, that you have other commitments. Nick, do you have any last word?
Not really. I mean, thank you to Jitendra, Purnima, for taking part in this. This has been a very enlightening conversation and very timely, obviously, and look forward to the next in the series. So I think the next ones will be focusing first, like Pablo said, on Israel, and then bringing it home to Colombia and seeing what steps will be needed to improve the innovation ecosystem for Colombia. So maybe looking forward as part of a closing remark, Jitendra, Purnima, for a place like Colombia, and any other advice as they look to continue to build out an innovation ecosystem in the current environment?
Yeah, I maybe I'll start. I think we're in an opportunity for new beginnings and maybe new evolutions. I really like what Purnima said about kind of being purposeful. Focus on the problem that you're trying to solve. Make it a big problem is what I would also say. And I think that's where everybody has an opportunity. And I think just like after the downturn, the people that took the risk back in 2008, 2009. The people that took the risk benefited quite greatly. There was a optimism where the future was going to go, and I think that opportunity is emerging for all of us, including Colombia. That it's an opportunity to invest in the new, and it's coming at a point where it's difficult right now, but hence the opportunity. I mean, it of course is, when are we coming out of this pandemic? Of course, there's some very practical questions in terms of health and safety that we still have to address. But I would maybe say as a parting thought, I think the opportunity is starting to emerge as we come out of the pandemic, eventually when we do. And I think that's a great time to put into motion the support for entrepreneurs, for startups, for innovators, to be able to accelerate through this.
Yeah, I would echo that. The best capital in any kind of situation is your youth, and Colombia has more than its share of it. Every time I meet people from your country, I'm inspired. They're smart, they're wonderful. They could stand shoulder to shoulder with anybody in the Silicon Valley. I would say listen to them, innovate, support them. I am truly impressed with the kinds of folks that I have met, and the entrepreneurs measure up. I think we just have to create the environment to let them shine.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jitendra. Thank you very much, Purnima. This has been a very insightful conversation. This, as I said before, you guys are in a great position to talk about the whole ecosystem, because you are not only you're connoisseurs of what is going on there, but you are in the middle of it, and you know exactly its dynamic. This is the third of our webinars. The first two will be shared next week. The first one is actually already posted in semana.com website, which was an interview to Ignacio Gaitan, director of Impulsa Colombia. So it has been already uploaded in the podcast of semana.com. We will then send you webinar number 2, in which we discussed how the ecosystems in the world work, specifically Silicon Valley and Israel. And this one, it's been a great pleasure to have you, Jitendra and Purnima. Number 4 webinar is going to be about the ecosystem of innovation in Israel in times of COVID-19. How is that ecosystem coping with it? What are entrepreneurs and investors doing? What trends are actually evolving right now? We're going to have Michael Abadi, who is the founder of Maverick Ventures. It's a boutique fund of risk capital from Israel. And we're also going to have Eduardo Zlotnik, who is the director and investor of Taranis, an innovation company for the food industry. And it's going to be an interesting conversation, because we're going to be discussing some of the topics that you guys mentioned today, about also the fear of failure and also the distance in hierarchies. So you guys, Jitendra and Purnima, are actually invited to join us in that conversation. Thank you very much. Nick, thank you very much. Alexandra, our great interpreter. She's our start. Thank you very much for your great job as always. And it's been a pleasure to have you guys, and you're very welcome to come to Colombia, and please do shout when you are around. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Bye, thanks.